As Shelley said, my name is Dan Feinberg. I'm the Assistant Director of Labor Relations and Legal Services here at MASB. I recently started here this past January. Prior to that, I spent about 8.5 years at the Michigan Legislature in the House doing education policy. So I've got some experience in all of this, and it's been kind of interesting on the learning curve here. Nonetheless, getting started with our presentation today. As everyone here probably remembers, back before the pandemic, board meetings would be, depending on the issue, maybe lightly attended, and public comment might involve something like this. The public participation, maybe a guy walking by, just a normal kind of run-of-the-mill day. And then when the pandemic came, everything shifted and changed, and the world was entirely different, and we were looking at situations like this. And there would be many, many screens of people, and they wanted to know what was going on, and they were looking to the school boards for direction. And as that began to settle in, and we began to discover the new normals of going towards the end of the pandemic, hopefully, things shifted in 2021, and all of the little faces on the screen here turned into this. And people wanted to know specifically what was going on, and there was lots of pushes, and we wanted the schools open or we wanted the schools closed, and it led to a lot of chaos. So with the future probably being a blend of a lot of these things, certainly the numbers of people, we need to talk about the Open Meetings Act. So just some brief background on the Open Meetings Act. It applies to all public bodies, which includes local and intermediate school district boards, as well as governing boards of public school academies. And it has a clear purpose, and always had, to promote governmental accountability by facilitating access for public official decision-making, basically making sure that everyone can see where the decisions are made in the meeting, a lot more transparency. And what the real key term in the OMA is the definition of a meeting. So meeting is defined as the convening of a public body at which a quorum is present for the purpose of deliberating towards the rendering of a decision on a public policy, or any meeting of a board of a nonprofit corporation formed under the city, under Section 4.0 of the Home Rule Act. So the key part here is if you have a quorum. So for a school board, if there's 7 members, you need 4. And if 4 are present in any sort of capacity, then you have a quorum, and you have to go through all the requirements of the Open Meeting Act, which includes having a public comment period, posting requirements, and everything else. Whether you're deliberating or not, if you have the quorum, that's going to be the big thing. So as a kind of a side tangent, and I think it's an important one, it's come up as a question of whether school board committees, so if a group of 3 are assigned to do some sort of work, are they also subject to the OMA? And the answer is yes, if a school board empowers the committee to perform a governmental function on behalf of the board. Then at that point, the committee becomes a public body. So if they're making a decision on something, if they're going to vote on something, that would be a scenario where they are considered a public body, and OMA would apply. The reasoning is if they're going to deprive the full board of their opportunity to vote on the issue, then they're acting in governmental authority. On the reverse of that, as long as the function is limited to just information gathering without making any decisions, then they are not subject to the requirements of the OMA. And this was actually shown in, and really kind of defined in, A Felon's Crusade for Equality, Honesty, and Truth versus Detroit Public School Community District Board of Education. So here, the Board of Education was beginning their process to look for their superintendent, and they started by looking for a search firm. So they formed a committee to look for the search firms to then bring them to the full board. So it was alleged that the committee violated the OMA by failing to post notices for its meetings, failing to hold meetings in public, and failing to maintain minutes, and privately deciding which search firm would be employed. That
Hey,
was what the
Dan.
case was. Yes.
Amy has a question. What if they make a recommendation to the full board? Is that considered just information gathering?
Well, that's a very interesting question because in this particular case, the committee had 3 applications. They put forward all 3 applications and they did in fact include a recommendation. However, the court affirmed that the committee was not a public body and did not have to comply with OMA. Their activities were deemed investigative. So they did derive their authority. The comparative test on this was a case called Booth, where the University of Michigan engineered their entire presidential search process and had constructive quorum of the board and did all of the things that you're not supposed to do, so they could line themselves up to pick the person that they wanted, and then it was just a done deal. They had one name come up and that was it. Everyone had done their deliberation in private. In this particular case, the board was free to consider the merits and perspective of all the prospective search firms in a meeting open to the public. I actually pulled up the case and there was a line in here that I think was very, very crucial. Let's see if I can't find it again. And no, it ran away from me. But basically the court recognized exactly, oh, here we go. As the plaintiff counsel conceded at oral argument, the committee screened 3 search firm candidates and presented all 3 to the board's consideration. Thus, unlike the evasive procedures used in Booth, the board was free to consider the merits of all 3 prospective search firms at a meeting open to the public. The mere fact that the committee recommended one of the firms as the most qualified search firm does not necessitate the conclusion that the committee was exercising the board's authority to choose the search firm. So you can make a recommendation. The board does not have to follow that recommendation. They are under no requirement to do so, and therefore recommendations are okay. So because the committee had gathered and presented information to the board and they had no authority to act on its own recommendation, they were not a public body.
Dan, Mary also has a question. She said, so in essence, any deliberation discussion about hiring a superintendent should be a public meeting when a quorum is met?
Yes, actually, part of the Felons Crusade, there was also discussion about their process in selecting the superintendent. When they went into their process and they had a list of 10 potential candidates that the search firm had brought forward, they were all reviewed briefly. There was a quick anonymous vote of the board just as far as seeing where people thought people were. It was not considered deliberative. It was just a kind of a check-in. And then they went out in public and began discussing using numbers for the candidates to maintain privacy for them. And they debated the merits of each of those candidates based on their numbers and then came to conclusions, narrowing their field down to 3. And that was a public action of the board in making that determination. And then of those 3, 1 dropped out, leaving the 2 that were left, and they went through their process publicly. And then they ended up with Dr. Vitti as their superintendent. So you cannot deliberate in closed sessions on employment issues for hiring superintendents, but you can go through and review the information. You can do a spot check, but you can't really discuss them. So when a committee is a public body, they have to comply with the same requirements that the full board has to comply with in the OMA. So this is posting public notice of your meetings. The meetings have to be available to the public. It has to include an opportunity for public comment, which is the thing we're talking about today. All decisions must be made in open session, and you have to keep minutes. So there are 3 sections of pertinent language that we need to discuss here. MCL 15-3634 says a person must not be required as a condition of attendance at a meeting or of a public body to register or otherwise provide his or her name or other information or otherwise fulfill a condition precedent to attendance. So you cannot block people from coming to the meeting. You can't require them to say who they are. Everyone has the right, regardless of whether they are a resident or a non-resident. Somebody walks into the building, you can't block them. The second section is sub 5 there, which is a person must be permitted to address a meeting of a public body under rules established and recorded by the public body. So everyone has the opportunity to address. Again, doesn't matter if they're a resident or not a resident. If they're there, they have the opportunity to address. And then sub 6 is a person must not be excluded from a meeting otherwise open to the public except for a breach of the peace actually committed at the meeting. If somebody's outside ranting and raving before the meeting and they come in, you can't use the information, what they were doing outside. They have to breach the peace inside, and we'll get more to that when we get closer, when we move along in this. So, as far as public comment at board meetings, as we said before, the person shall be permitted. So under the rules established. Now, the rules must be reasonable, flexible, and written in a way that encourages public participation. That is a crucial element that has to happen. You can't write the rules in ways that would exclude people. So if it's reasonable, that it is reasonable to have individuals identify themselves and provide notice that they wish to speak to the board in order to facilitate the orderly conduct of a meeting. Certainly to identify that they wish to speak. This helps the boards as far as determining how much time that they're going to have to allocate, if it makes sense, if they're going to keep the public comment where it is in their agenda, if they need to move it, so they can utilize that for those purposes. And school board public participation rules assist in balancing the board's interests in conducting the meeting in an orderly manner with individuals' rights under the First Amendment. Which brings us to when to have public comment. As I said before, depending on your bylaws, there are 3 options that Neola has put forward. One is as indicated in the order of business, which is probably the broadest because you can put wherever you want. You can break it apart as you need to, and you can move it if you shift things in your agenda. Before the board takes official action on an issue of substance, this is one of those issues that if you were going to try to break it apart in your Neola policy, that you would only have people talk about one particular issue as that issue comes up, and then move on to the next issue and have people address that one. And then at a time determined by the presiding officer, also very flexible. 1 and 3 have a lot of flexibility. 2, if that was your policy, actually gets a little constrictive. So this is going to be a little interactive. So with a pop quiz, so on public comment timing, per the adopted board policy, public comment at the beginning of a meeting, public comment is at the beginning of a meeting. Midway through the meeting, a member of the public stands up and demands to address the board. Must the board acquiesce? Anyone have any thoughts? Feel free to fill in the chat.
No.
No way.
So that is correct. The answer is no. So Lysigorski versus the Charter Township of Bridgeport. Lysigorski alleged that the township board violated the OMA by denying citizens' requests to address the board after the time of public comment had expired. The Bridgeport rule limiting public comment was to a prescribed time at the beginning of the meeting was found to be compatible with the OMA. The court also recognized that the OMA does not require an agenda detailing the items to be discussed at a public meeting. So that area of, when you can appoint the period for public comment kind of weighs in on that. The other next question is about public comment and the length of comment. So this is something that you need to have in your bylaws. MASB advises that the time limit should be no less than 3 minutes for a person, and it has to be enforced consistently. You don't have to allow and permit sharing of time. If your bylaws are limiting public participation to a specific time frame, you cannot use that to deny people their opportunity to speak. That bylaw would violate the OMA. So looking at those factors, we have some sample public comment rule language to consider. Basically, it's saying the public participation portion of the meeting is limited to 1/2 hour, but the time frame will be extended if necessary so that no one's right to address the board will be denied. Putting in this language gives you that wiggle room to say we want to keep it at a 1/2 hour if we can. If we can't, we understand that we'll have to go further. And then as far as limiting the time of people, each person will be allowed to speak for up to 5 minutes, except where the number of speakers exceed the above time limit. In those instances, the president may either reduce the 5-minute limit to a 3-minute limit for each speaker, and the Board of Education shall waive the 1/2 hour time limit. So again, our recommendation that you not take it shorter than 3 minutes. That should be enough time for somebody to get up and say concisely what they need to say. Hopefully they can be concise. And the real key on this is to ensure that you are enforcing it equally across the board.
Hey, Dan.
Yes.
Got Amy here saying, can you adjust the time of each person if there's a prescribed time frame, and can it be less than 3 minutes?
Adjusting the time for each individual, if you aren't consistent in your application, you can run into some trouble with the OMA. You could end up being found in violation because if you're shortchanging one person, it doesn't mean every person has to have 3 minutes, and therefore when they're done, if there's still a minute left, there has to be silence. It just means that at 3 minutes, you stop the person from speaking and tell them, your 3 minutes is up. As far as adjusting the time as the 1/2 hour limit, if you have more people, you should extend the time limit. Again, if you end up saying, well, sorry, we're out of time now, the public has not been allowed to speak, and that would be considered a violation of the OMA likely. Let's see, finish that one. Yeah. So the next question is about addressing the chair rule. Generally in meetings, it makes sense to, especially with the public, normally the board is supposed to do the same, but with the public, when they're making their comments, they need to speak to the chair of the board, not across the board to everybody. It helps to limit potential side conversations or accusations or problems coming up when somebody is not addressing the board. It keeps the formality there. So requiring commentary to be directed to the chair to ensure that commentators do not incite other attendees or heckle or debate the commentary or otherwise disrupt the orderly progress of the public participation period. The Court of Appeals recently ruled that the address the chair rule is legally enforceable under the First Amendment. They said the rule was reasonably calculated to ensure orderly participation of the community members who wish to express their views without targeting the content of their viewpoint. So everyone has to address the chair. Again, there's consistency in your enforcement of that rule. If somebody's saying something that you really, really like, but they're saying it to the crowd, you have to stop them from doing that to keep the formality in your public comment periods.
Dan, Stacy's asking, is bullet number 1 part of the Open Meeting Act or Robert's Rules of Order?
I'm sorry, what the
Bullet number 1.
It kind of both. Robert's Rules of Order talks about addressing the chair. The OMA does not require it, but it's been accepted and said that that is an okay policy. So Robert's Rules of Order does not violate the OMA by requiring that. So another pop quiz, complaints. So a school board adopts a policy to not permit complaints against school personnel to be expressed in open meetings in the school board. The board distributes as part of its agenda, a statement on the bottom of the page saying the Board of Education shall not permit complaints against school personnel to be expressed in an open meeting. Such concerns should be submitted in writing to the board and eventually aired in the open or closed session according to the wish of the persons involved. So is this enforceable under the OMA or the First Amendment? Which is going to trump out here? Anybody got thoughts? So it's the First Amendment. Boards cannot adopt a rule in its bylaws that prohibits citizens from publicly criticizing or making complaints against school employees by name during public comment. You can still have a rule that encourages citizens to process complaints through the proper personnel and administrative channels before requesting board consideration. You can strongly encourage people, but if someone's going to go up and they want to complain about a particular teacher because they gave their kid a poor grade, or an example I was using at one point, somebody's flutist child was not made the first chair, even though they think their child is the best flutist, and the band teacher thought otherwise, they can come up and complain to the board. They can address it to the chair. It's unfortunate that things like that do happen, but they do have a right to do that. That being said, comments that constitute a personal attack on an employee or a board member that are unrelated to their duties can be prohibited. So arguing that the band teacher doesn't know what they're talking about and is a bad band teacher because they didn't make their kid the first chair on flute, they can complain about that. Saying that the band teacher is a bad band teacher because they dress funny, how they dress isn't part of the job, arguably, and therefore you could say that's not an appropriate comment and that you can stop that.
Dan, when a public speaker demands an answer during public comment, do boards have to respond?
No. The board doesn't, the right to address the board is not a guarantee of a response or an answer. In fact, one of the reasons why collecting names and addresses of individuals when they are planning to speak to the board, one of the arguments you can make to encourage people to do that is to say, you're bringing an issue up to us. We probably won't have an answer for you right here, but we can do the research and get an answer to you, and then we can send it to you if we have your name and your address. So the board does not have to address the issue that somebody brings up. The board can say, the chair can say, thank you for your comments, and go from there. And that's part of the issue of controlling complaints. If someone's up there and they're complaining about something, you can say, we'll look into it and we'll be done. Here's some language that MASB suggests as a way to try to help control the complaints. To ensure due process and respect of individuals' rights, the district maintains a formal process of handling complaints against individuals. A problem involving an individual or specific incident is best handled through administrative channels. For assistance, please contact the superintendent's office. Speakers are asked to express themselves in a civil manner with due respect for the dignity and privacy of others who may be affected by your comments. While it is not the intent to stifle public comment, speakers should be aware that if your statements violate the rights of others under the law of defamation or invasion of privacy, you may be held legally responsible. If you are unsure of the legal ramifications of what you are about to say, we urge you to consult first with your legal advisor. Defamation suits are not a common thing, but it is definitely some language that can be used to give people pause, and it works. So it's something that you can put out there. You're not prohibiting somebody from speaking. You're just advising them that they should consider the words that they're about to use.
So Dan, to add on to that, we got a question. What if someone is commenting on an ongoing personnel investigation? Can they mention names?
They can. An individual person that is out there from the public going up and making a public comment has the ability to comment. The board does not and should not respond to anything on that beyond "thank you for your commentary." Whether you're acknowledging that there's an ongoing investigation or not acknowledging there's an ongoing investigation, if people from the public are coming forward and saying things like that, then people know about it. It's probably best to just thank them for their comments and move along.
Does that also include student names?
Yes. If the public says it, it's unfortunate. The board saying names shouldn't happen. So personal attacks, as I kind of said before, if they're unrelated to their duties. So you can have a rule that prohibits abusive attacks, personally abusive attacks during public comment. If it's a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction, as long as it's content neutral, narrowly tailored to serve the significant government interests. So again, the key on this is consistent enforceability. If someone is getting up and they're just raving praise over the band teacher because they know what they're doing, their flute playing child was made first chair and clearly they're the best, and so they want to just have a love fest for the band teacher, it's not a personal attack, but you may want to point out that, depending on what your rule and how it's written, personal attacks or commentary, trying to keep it narrowed down. But if you're narrowing on one way, you need to narrow on the other way. And you need to be consistent on it. Even if you agree with the person and they're attacking somebody for something that is terrible, make sure that you're consistent. Let's see. So now we're at public meetings and large groups, which is something that a lot of the districts have been dealing with. So as we've kind of talked about, the rules cannot limit the right to address the board to residents of the school district. Anyone that can walk in has the ability to address the board. Even if they get up, they say their name and their address is elsewhere, they still have the right to address the board. This has been a bit of an issue. I'm sure everyone has either seen it or heard about it, where busloads of people have been coming around because the issue of the day was CRT and not wanting to have that taught in the schools. So people, from all around would show up and go to the board meeting and complain about it, even though it wasn't part of the agenda, it wasn't on the curriculum, it wasn't something that the school was teaching. It still became the issue because somebody thought it was, or that became the place that somebody decided would have made sense politically to do that. You can't stop them from coming in to address the boards. It is reasonable to have individuals identify themselves and provide notice they wish to speak. It is reasonable to request the group to designate a spokesperson. So 75 people show up, you can ask them if they could just have one person speak on behalf of all of them. They may say yes, they may say no. Some other tools that you can use if there's that many people and it's too unwieldy, you can table the public comment until later in the meeting. So if you had it at the beginning, put it off to the end and get done with the actual business that the board has to do, and then see how you can handle things after that. It does some benefit for the people that are there for other, for actual reasons of the board. So you can handle it that way. You can recess a meeting. So you can recess it at the beginning, middle, or end of the meeting. If you recess a meeting, there are certain requirements in the OMA for when you have to reconvene. I believe it's within 36 hours. I should know that off the top of my head. Unfortunately, I don't. But you can come back into the meeting at a later date, which means that group would have to leave and come back. So it's a tool that you might be able to use. Depends on kind of what the issue is, and you have to balance out if they're all going to come back. Are you going to save yourself time, or are you going to put yourself in continuation of a meeting? And then removing disruptive and unruly individuals. Those individuals have to commit a breach of the peace. So you can't just remove somebody because they're repetitive or they're shifting around in their seat. They actually have to do something that's considered to be breaching the peace. So This brings us to the last subsection that we need to talk about, that a person shall not be excluded from the meeting otherwise open to the public except for a breach of the peace actually committed. So the OMA does not define breach of the peace, but the Michigan courts have opined that it constitutes seriously disruptive conduct involving abuse, disorderly, dangerous, aggressive, or provocative speech and behaviors tending to threaten or incite violence. The cases basically clarify that breach of the peace goes well beyond acceptable behavior. So the courts have said a little in further, the mere violation of a rule cannot automatically constitute a breach of the peace and expulsion solely for not abiding by such rule without more. It violates the prohibition against exclusion of a person from the public meeting. The trial courts have upheld expulsions in meetings, and the Court of Appeals has reversed on that decision. Cusimano versus Dunn, it's a relatively recent case where that happened. And they said that although the public bodies may establish and enforce recorded rules that limit public comment, such authority does not nullify the prohibition against exclusion of any person from a public meeting except for breach of the peace at the meeting. So in this particular case, let's see. The local government was excluding somebody out of the meeting because they had violated a couple of the rules, and that wasn't enough to count as a breach of the peace. So we're going to look at three scenarios now. The first one is a contentious issue is being addressed by the board. Filled with passion in the issue, an individual expresses their disappointment with the board's vote by calling them an expletive. Would this rise to the level of a breach of the peace? Does anybody have thoughts on that? It doesn't. People have their First Amendment rights. The use of swear words and foul language, it's not ideal, but it is not something that could be considered to rise to that level of inciting violence. Obviously, it depends on the usage of that terminology. If somebody is in fact using other words around it that they're going to incite, that could incite violence or likely will incite violence, then that individual is maybe getting there from a different way, but not from the foul language. A second example, a member of the public at a board meeting addresses the school board's newly adopted policy against allowing bake sales of homemade cookies. The individual steps away from the podium and begins distributing homemade cookies to the members of the board, imploring them to eat the cookies. This is actually sort of a example built off of a real event that occurred in a state legislative hearing where the House Education Committee was debating what was called the bake sale bills. This was 5-6 years ago. And a woman came up and was testifying about how she thought it was important that they be able to do all of these things, and then literally walked around in front of every person trying to give them a cookie, encouraging them to eat them. It made the sergeants there uncomfortable. It made everyone in the room uncomfortable. But would this be considered something that is rising to the level of a breach of the peace? I think you're getting more into a gray area there. A lot of it more is going to be based on the tone. If they're relatively calm and they're imploring for people to eat the cookies, then probably not. Then they're probably breaking a rule as far as addressing the chair only, or the decorum of the hearing, but it's not necessarily a breach of the peace. Third, a frequent flyer member of the public comes to the board yet again and refuses to comply with any of the board's adopted rules in relation to public comment. And after the third violation of the board policies, the president asks for the individual to be removed. So again, this would be based on the totality of the situation. If it's been a constant and escalating problem and they have gone outside of the are they being boisterous in their violation of the rules? Are they fighting with the president about these things? Those are all factors that are going to weigh in on this. The bottom line is breach of the peace has a element of community standard, and it has to be an egregious breach of that. So I guess keeping that in mind when you're looking at that is as a factor of how to moderate that issue.
Dan, there's a couple questions in the chat. What is the best way to stop a person from talking when they have reached their time limit and will not stop?
Different boards can use different methods. There have been places where somebody will have a timekeeper, the secretary of the board can have a sign that says, 1 minute, 30 seconds, and hold that up so the speaker can see it. That could be combined with the chair stopping the person at the 3 minutes and thanking them and saying that your time has expired. Those are going to be your best ways to be able to do that. If you have the technology to cut off microphones, if you're using them, some school boards have that, some don't. But it's okay to stop a person after they've reached the maximum time. And if they keep going, you can, firmly ask them to stop again. If they continue to violate that, at some point you start crossing over to that question of, and assuming it would escalate, that could put you in a question where you can then say you are beginning to breach the peace of this meeting, and you can ask for the person to be removed eventually. That could put you in that gray area, but that's an option. Normally, if you just have the little placards, calm but firm statement that your time is up, thank you for your comments. And just again, the main thing is to ensure that you are consistent with it. If you shortchange some people and give other people longer periods before you interject, you're going to run into more problems.
And then one other one, Donald said during the pandemic that his board was called cowards for their decisions. And is that considered a personal attack?
I guess you could say it's a personal attack, but it is tied to the job. Generally, personal attack, anything that is negative could be considered a personal attack, but calling somebody a coward because they don't like the way they voted on the issues before the board, that is disagreeing with their positions on the board, which they have the right to do. So I don't think that would rise up to a level of whether it's a breach or not a breach of the peace or a violation of personal attacks. So the last thing that we need to talk about, I kind of went through my time pretty quick here today, so I'm happy to entertain questions after this. The OMA during the pandemic was amended to allow for virtual participation and virtual meetings in general. And that was largely based on a factor of safety for everybody. And that went through until December 31st, 2021. So as of January 1st, 2022, the ability to have a virtual meeting or have participation in virtual meetings has been limited down only to a member of the board being able to participate virtually only if they are away on military service. So whereas it was much broader before, and if somebody was sick or if they had COVID and were able to participate online, that is no longer allowed. On February 4th, the Attorney General issued an opinion that said the ADA requires public bodies to provide reasonable accommodations, which could include an option to participate virtually to qualified individuals with a disability who request an accommodation in order to fully participate as a board member or community member in meetings required by the OMA to be held in places available to the general public. So it did not say that meetings could happen entirely virtually. You still have a physical presence meeting, but if somebody became a qualified individual under the ADA, which has certain requirements that have to be met, then virtual participation could be an option. And in allowing that, it created a scenario where there was a lot of question of what that meant. So as far as board members, if somebody were to have a compromised immune system because they were going through cancer treatment, this is an example that we've been using, they would be able to request as a qualified participant because they have a malady or an illness that qualifies under that, to be able to participate virtually. The decision would be made by the board or the president, whatever your structure is, to make that decision of who, if they're a qualified individual. And if allowing them to participate virtually in a two-way could be allowed. It does, because boards were doing it before, the argument was it shouldn't be that difficult to reinstitute that sort of a situation for somebody, since many of the boards were doing it before anyhow. With the public, it gets a little trickier. So if a member of the public is a qualified individual and requests the accommodation to address the board, you have options available to meet that accommodation. So just because somebody says that they want to participate virtually in a two-way so they can make a comment to the board, doesn't mean you have to do that. You can say, we aren't broadcasting if you're not broadcasting, or we have chosen not to have two-way communication virtually. So we can take your comments, we can have the secretary read your comments into the board during the public comment period, so you will achieve that goal of having your comments stated. And that would meet that requirement as well. If you're not having two-way virtual communication, you don't have to open it up for that person. You don't have to go through the test to determine if they are a qualified individual. They still would have to be a qualified individual. I don't live in the area is not a qualification under the ADA. So you have options on that one. From a best practices standpoint, if a school board is not conducting a virtual meeting in whole or in part under the OMA, so if you're not doing the virtual, MASB recommends that the board limit public comment to individuals who are attending the meeting in person. Again, if somebody sends in and they say, I am not able to, you can still take their public comment that they want to submit. That's what we would encourage as far as trying to get those issues addressed. They still would achieve their goal. The accommodation was made that something is read in without them even being present in the room. That covers through my presentation. I hope it was helpful. If there are more questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
And there's a couple in the chat. Diane said, I missed the answer on the expletive. Is there only a breach if they continue and it becomes disruptive?
So there's a difference between somebody that is cursing as part of their general pattern of language and someone who is using offensive language in an aggressive manner. If they're threatening the board that they're going to beat them all up, and they're, whether they say I'm going to beat you all up or they phrase it a little harsher, they're threatening the board at that point. So the issue is less the caliber of the word and more the intent behind it. If somebody disagrees with a decision of the board and their statement is, I disagree with your decision as a board, but phrased much more colorfully, then that's just a application of, they're disagreeing with the decision of the board. So again, it becomes very fact intensive and very fact based. And a lot of it is the demeanor of the person. The difference of if somebody pounds their fist as a point of emphasis in their public comment at the podium, that's not generally considered a breach of the peace. That's somebody that's emphasizing a point that they're making. If they are making more comments that they're threatening people and they're pounding on the podium or actually trying to hit other people, then you're looking at a scenario where they are breaching the peace. It has to be something that goes far beyond the pale of the community standards, very far beyond.
What evidence would be required of the member of the public to be deemed qualified?
So that is a test that is placed under the ADA. And it's not a black and white checklist of 5 things that you have to do. There are parameters and there's a whole body of case law around that in trying to shape that. There was a case, unfortunately, I don't remember the name of it, but it was described as a slam dunk that the person was a qualified person under the ADA during the pandemic because they were a 98-year-old man with a significant heart condition. So he was allowed to participate virtually because it was, they determined that he was a qualified person. But somebody calling in because they have a cold, it's a cold, and before the pandemic, I know it's a long time ago, but people showed up to things when they weren't feeling well or had a cold. One of the issues that has come up a lot is when a board member may ask, well, can I participate virtually because I'm out of state? Being out of state is not a reason to allow virtual participation under the OMA currently. The OMA contemplates in-person meetings, and the way under the current law, it does not allow for any virtual participation outside of that military exemption.
What about if a member of the public can't attend a meeting? Can they give their written statement to another member of the public to read aloud during public comment?
Probably, yeah. It's a person that's getting up, and if they're reading somebody else's comments, that's their choice as the member of the public that they're doing that. Now, a more interesting question is if that person were to get up and say, I'm reading this comment from this person, and now I'd like my 3 minutes. That I don't know if they would be able to get that because they've chosen to use their time to address the public or to address the board and giving somebody else, carrying somebody else's water. Especially when that person could have contacted the board and said, I want my comments read in by the board. So that if somebody showed up with a stack of things from 75 people, they don't have the right to go and read that for 75 different people. You can ask them to distill that down.
Amy, oh, sorry, Phil. Amy earlier in the chat had mentioned that they had a 45-minute period and had 100 people show up. So she asked, can we reduce the amount of public comment time per person to fit within a certain time frame, even if that's under 3 minutes?
We don't recommend it. When you start getting under 3 minutes, people start feeling like they're not getting their chance to say what they need to say. And then you can start running into problems where somebody may claim that there's an OMA violation. If you down to 45 minutes and you have 100 people with everybody else, you're really talking about a minute, 90 seconds per person, and a court may find that that is de facto limiting public participation.
Locally, do we need to allow them in public meeting if they are going against, say, the mask mandate and won't put them on? Is this breach of peace?
Probably not. It's an interesting question as far as, wearing a mask or not wearing a mask is become such a fluid thing. Somebody not, choosing not to wear a mask, that could be considered a free speech issue if they frame it as such, and that would give them First Amendment coverage as far as whether or not they choose to wear that or not.
So somebody else had a question of, we've been streaming to Facebook and recently have made the move to turn comments off since our board is unable to respond directly and consistently. Any concerns with this practice, or is this for a different topic?
The meeting, if the meeting is still happening in a public place and there are people that are present that are able to address the board that way, I think if you're maintaining that aspect, turning off the comment section on Facebook, it's almost analogous to when you would just broadcast out on cable access the hearings. So I think in that sort of a scenario, you can probably turn that off. You're not required to have that mechanism as long as you have public comment going on in the meeting and you're allowing people to address the board that way. That's just my opinion.
Got a couple more here as we're filing in. If somebody says you will pay and points to all of us, is that considered a threat in their intent and or a breach of peace?
I'm not a judge, but I would say probably not. It's certainly a heated comment, but it's pretty broad and diffuse. You will pay could mean you're going to pay at the ballot box, which is not a pleasant thing, but that's just part of life. You will pay could mean, you know, people protesting. It could mean other issues that are other political tools that are out there. It's a far cry from somebody saying, I'm going to burn your house down, at which point then that's a pretty direct threat.
If we have 2 periods of public comment, can the same individual comment during both periods?
If it's different commentary, probably I would say they can. If they're just going to say the same thing that they said before, it's an issue of becoming repetitive. And you can point out to people, you've made this comment before tonight, we've heard you, thank you.
How in the realm of public live streaming, what is the best practice to notify the public that public comment will not be accepted through that live stream?
Maybe announcing at the beginning of the meeting that, you know, we are live streaming this. If it's a one-way live, but it's a one-way live stream, we're not, you know, public comment is from people that are here. If you're turning it off on Facebook, as an example, I mean, it becomes clear that it's not available for the public comment on that side because you can't do it. So I would think making those announcements and not broadcasting it in a live stream capacity where there is two-way capability.
Is it up to the board to make the decision of whether or not a person is qualified? If not, who makes that decision?
That is a really good question to which I don't have a solid answer. A lot of that's going to depend on your local decision and on your local decisions on that. If it's going to be something the board has to vote on, if it's something that the president makes a decision on unilaterally based on the facts that are there, if you're working with your legal counsel, if you need to make those sorts of decisions. And there's not a great answer on that point yet. When this opinion came out, everyone kind of, we looked at it, Brad and I were like, well, who's going to make that call? So it's whatever's going to work out best for you guys. Good rule of thumb would be whatever your current decision process under the ADA is, just follow that. That'd be my recommendation.
Okay, and then last one in the chat. What if someone comes to the podium and wants to hold their cell phone to the microphone so the person on the phone could make a comment? This is without an accommodation request.
Again, this is just my thoughts on that, not being the judge or jury. I think that would probably be analogous to a person reading somebody else's commentary, just using technology in that perspective. They might get to do that once, but then they wouldn't get to give their piece about it.
Any other questions for Dan, folks? And thank you, Nathan, for sharing that information of how you let folks know about the fully in-person and streaming. That's a good resource.
I don't have the comments up, so.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. Thank you, everyone, for your participation in this very important topic.